welcome back. First thing, like a technical thing, is it a problem for you if we record what is recording for documentation? So, is it okay for you? Yes? Okay. So, welcome back. This is the part where the guests from the summer school of will talk. The first talk will be by Alastair Fuad-Luke, and then we have Vanessa De Luca, and then Gabriele Ropallo. So this is your time to. So for the people that are not are not participating on a daily basis on the summer school, this year we are focusing on the roots of design and nature in the island of Madeira. And for us, this moment is a moment of gathering ideas and different points of view. So it's a moment of study and research and exploration. And this year we focus also on how we could understand nature and the ecosystems and how also we can represent it by doing a lot of field work. I leave the space to Alastair, and then it will be Vanessa, and then Gabriele.
Bem-vindo para todos, but that's the limit of my Portuguese. No, it's not, but I think it's better because I'm using some terminology tonight that I say in English. But I want to make a little link from the film we just saw, a remarkable film. And I was trying to think, well, if I was having to summarize that to someone, what would I say? And I think a lot of the film was looping around the idea of cultivating, growing, looking after things, and letting them die, and letting other things be reborn. And a very important thing that I think Lord Castro said was that we don't do things alone. I think you have something like Donna Harambe might say we're all entangled. We live in a great entanglement. And I hope something of that comes through my talk tonight. I hope also too that it's made available through the University of Madeira, because my talks tend to be a little bit dense. So if you get lost, don't worry. Maybe there's a copy you can look at, or maybe you just take what you want from it. So I start with this idea, which I wrote about actually a few years ago, complementary relational designers. And you'll see that I don't mean just us. I don't mean just us humans. We're designing with others. Maybe they will be revealed. So how designing with others, human and other than human, challenges what Jacques Rancière, the philosopher, said, the distribution of the sensible. And I've always seen that as our job, actually. But I didn't come across Rancière's work for some time, but when I did, it really resonated with me. So I got moved to the next slide, I think. I start with Donna Haraway, a great commentator on this idea of entanglement. And I'm just going to read out the quotation from her book, Staying with the Trouble, which she wrote in 2016. The more one looks, the more the name of the game of living and dying on Earth is a convoluted multi-species affair that goes by the name of symbiosis, the yoking together of companion species at the table together. Yoking is when you have two oxen, two cattle, and you put a yoke. It can also be a thing where you carry two milk pails, so it has balance in it as well. Actually, this might not be a bad link to the film we've just seen in many ways. And then she talks about sympoiesis, enlarges and displaces autopoiesis. We talk about plants having autopoiesis. They can grow what they need. And all of the self-forming and self-sustaining system fantasies. So she's saying autopoiesis is a fantasy. We can't make things just on our own. Everything needs something else. Sympoiesis is a carrier bag for ongoingness. I guess we could say this is an ontology of going forward. Being, but going forward. a yoke for becoming with, for staying with, the trouble of inherited damages and achievements of colonial and post-colonial natural cultural histories in telling the tale of still possible recuperation. For those who went to the islands of Desertas yesterday, this last phrase about post-colonial natural cultural histories is still resonating. On the island of Madeira, we see development, as we saw in Lourdes Castro film. But on the Desertas Islands, we still have a post-colonial effect there. It's still living. It's called the goat. The goat is still eating the vegetation and basically providing a colonial landscape as a result of it being there. The goat is not natural to those islands. So there's a lot going on here, and Haraway is typically very dense in her text. You often have to read it 2 or 3 times before you can take something from it. I move on a bit faster. I wrote something recently in a book by Tom Beeling, Design and Activism, where I was updating some of my thinking, and I define poiesis slightly differently. I defined it as an action that transforms and continues the world. So if we take an action as designers that stops the world, it's not poiesis. Symbiosis, we have symbiotic bacteria in our stomachs. We're actually walking zoos. We have many things living in and on us, and actually without them, we couldn't be human. So we have symbiosis, and we have some sympoiesis. We have some transforming and going on together. So when you get good gut bacteria from a yogurt or from nice bread, it keeps us going on. When you get bad gut bacteria, it can actually kill you. So it requires that we care for and have empathy for humans and for other than human, non-human, other living beings, and abiotic things too, minerals. We need minerals for our body. In a caring worldview, diversity becomes an essential predisposition to ensure its continuance for future living beings. That is to move forward in what the evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis called symbiogenesis. So this is symbiosis and sympoiesis, allowing us to a genesis, allowing us to go into the future. So it's a delicate balance as we see. I believe therefore we should talk about diversities, plural. And I'm just going to give a few slides and how we can look after these diversities. I'll give you a few slides on this. If we look at our agricultural diversity, this is a slide showing the loss of different cultivars of agricultural crops in the United States from 1903 to 1983. You see this bandwidth here shows very large numbers of different types of vegetables and fruit, and then we're getting a very narrow bandwidth, meaning we've only got a few cultivars. So if you look at the end of the 19th century, or beginning of the 20th century, our agricultural diversity was huge. I think if you look back in the records of Portugal, before and after joining the EU, you were exporting hundreds of different kinds of crops, and then you came down to a rather small number. So this is tied, of course, into an intensive agriculture model. This is some work that one of my colleagues did, Matteo Moretti at the University of Bolzano, where I work. He did the visualization. And this shows from 1996 to 2016 the aggregation of seed companies. And you will know if you follow this kind of topic that Bayer and Monsanto joined together in one of the biggest seed companies in the world. Of course, this is power and it's control, but it's also a reduction of diversity. It's not in their interest to have thousands of different lines. They come down to a few lines of genotype. However, there are opportunities being explored. This is very interesting. This is design at the top left here. I think I've got a slide later on too, where he was using a seed drill and putting in lines where you see the bare soil. He was drilling wildflowers. So he's allowing corridors of wildlife to go through the commercial crop of wheat. This has been tested more recently, a few years later, by Agroscope, a Swiss project, where they're putting lines of wildflowers. For me, I should say my first life was as an ecologist, environmental scientist, and only the last 20 years I've been working in design. So for me, this is absolutely normal. I did a company in the 1980s, we were the first commercial company to sow wildflowers to restore natural vegetation. This is how you keep and maintain the diversity. Why is it important? Because you bring in different kinds of insects. You bring in predators on the insects that are eating your precious grain. There's many, many things going on. We have an other than human in the audience, it's great. And people are even making special wallpapers here using these harvested wildflowers. This was the project. It involved GPS navigation with the tractor and a special drill where sometimes they would drill oats and sometimes they would drill wildflower seeds. It was very complex. But this came from a designer actually before the agricultural experimental station started working with it. So it's very interesting work. Then I talk about the loss of our diversity. This is the loss of languages in Europe. We think in nation states there's 22 in the EU, but there are many, many languages, minority languages, that are also being lost. We have to pay attention to this loss of language because there's a fascinating study done here where there is a link proven between the diversity of human languages and the biological diversity. When you think about it, it makes sense a little bit because we use language to describe the world, and maybe our language, I'm sure in different valleys here in Madeira there's a different dialect and maybe they grow different things, and there's a different way of expressing how the world is and therefore a different way of thinking about diversity. So this is a very interesting study, and to me it made a bit of sense again that if we look back at the names of old plants here in Madeira, can we still find the people who have the knowledge on those plants? Or do we lose it when the language is lost? There are some 6,000 human languages in the world, but maybe 20 which are dominating human communication. So all of those languages give a different perspective. And I think that's important when we talk about diversity. Of course, maybe you know this 6 mass extinction question mark, but if you look at the geological record, the decline of species is dramatic. If you look at the endangered red list, the international red list of endangered species, and there was an art project, I think, where they sounded a gong every time a species went extinct. We're living this, and maybe we've all been part of unintentionally contributing to it through the way we live our lives. But in my lifetime, we've lost species that we discovered. And this was a mapping of diversity, and just all you have to focus on here, this is a project, I'm trying to remember where it's from now, I forgot to put it was a UN-funded project. Where you see red, it means the diversity is going down. These are different ecosystems. And there's only one coal grassland system where the diversity is okay. So most of our ecosystems, in terms of health, if they went to the doctor would say, you're in bad shape. You need to do something urgently. But here we're talking about ecosystems. Also, our ecosystems are threatened by invasive species, and I was reading here that legumes, also mimosa, I think is here on Madeira, just here. Mimosa is not native to Europe, and it's a very aggressive species, and it can kill the local diversity, like any invasive species. We can't blame them, because often we're the agents that brought them in the first place. The same for Madeira here. Many, many plants arrived through our activities. And just before I left Portugal in 2016, this is February 2016, I started a little project to look at whether we could make things from this invasive species to remove it, because the economic problem is nobody's managing it, nobody's cutting it, nobody's allowing the other vegetation to come back. But perhaps we could make things from it. So this was just an afternoon's work, just experimenting with this material. Many years ago I learned some professional basket making, and it's a good material. It goes really rigid and black and hard and very tough, and I'm sure we could make lots of things from it. Also, we're seeing this phenomenon in Europe. These are different predictions, scenarios for the abandonment of agricultural land. And where I come from in South Tyrol, where I'm working at present, which is somewhere up here on the border with Austria, it's a province which is both German-speaking and Italian-speaking. There's not so much land abandonment, but in the province to the south, Belluno, there's large areas of agricultural land that were used in the 18th, 19th centuries and 20th century and are being abandoned. And this is seen somewhere as a problem, but I come back to it. Maybe it's not such a big problem. Oh, sorry, I got the slide here. There's an interesting book about rewilding. Rewilding has got two different kind of camps. There's anthropocentric rewilding, where we encourage rewilding, but we still want to visit and we still want to have so you could say that national parks are kind of a step in the right direction to get some anthropocentric rewilding, to protect. You okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay. To protect certain types of vegetation and land management. But on the other hand, there are chapters in this book, interestingly by two Portuguese people, Pereira and Navarro. There are chapters in the book where they say we have to leave some land completely to nature, where we don't even enter it. This is a challenging concept, of course, here in crowded Europe. So I've started to think about diversity in this way. I put Donna Haraway's idea of multi-species diversity, and I talk about anthro-diversity, human diversity, languages, perspectives. I talk about agricultural diversity because we need that too to ensure our food supplies in the future. And I talk about biodiversity. And I think maybe there's some relations. I haven't done any more work on this, but maybe there's different relations here. For instance, multi-cultures, multi-bio-organic agri-cultures, multi-ecologies, ecological rewilding, maybe agroecology somewhere between those, maybe anthropocentric rewilding, and maybe multi-agricultures there. I'm doing a little project where I split the word agriculture into agri and culture, because you need a culture to sustain an agriculture. And what is the culture that's driving agriculture today? It's largely the culture of the big six, because there are 6 enormous agricultural companies that drive a lot of the world agriculture. 4 in the United States and 2 in Asia. And they really control a lot of our agriculture. So if we diversify how we think about agriculture, for sure, we implicitly address this diversity triangle, as I call it. So I think we need to address this idea of diversity. Of course, we've had an ethical turn in design. This is a recent example, Stephen Liu. And he talks about design, humans to non-humans, non-sentient and non-living entities. How do we design for those rocks we saw on Desertus Island? Can we design for rocks? Are they part of who the other we're designing for? It's a question, I don't know. But I think we can if we think about it intelligently. And humans to technologically mediated realm of objects and constructed environments. So for me, I think my work in design has always had deep ethical roots. And he talks about 3 orders. Design mediates people-to-people relations. We were actually asked on the island of Desertus yesterday by the lady running a project looking after the monk seals. Could we as designers communicate, get a kind of phrase and communicate with people to kind of stay away from the monk seals? You know, people are getting too close. There are all sorts of issues there. So could we as designers, she saw us as communicators, could we do something there? So not just mediate people to people, but also mediate people to wild animals relations. And design is implicated in modifications to natural environment. This one we can see. And design necessitates ethical frameworks. I just put in one or two examples, but this is Christian Mendersma, one sheep cardigan. So this builds a relationship between the pullover you wear and one sheep. I think she could take this work a lot further. What if we all owned a sheep? What if every citizen in Portugal owned a sheep? Yes, immediately we have a different relationship. What then as designers would we do in terms of that relationship between me, the citizen, and my sheep? And would we be able to think on behalf of what's good for the sheep too? If we said to the sheep, we're going to put you on desertus to replace the goats, maybe they're not so happy. So it creates immediately, if we have one sheep as a citizen, it creates immediately an area where we have to get involved in ethics. So this is an interesting project from a designer. And then as designers, especially through this area we call research through design, we use many artifacts to build relationships. This is an artifact to help school children who know very little about bees to bring them back to understanding what a bee is. And by the way, when we think of bees, you're probably thinking of all the bees that live together in a nice little home called a hive. But the majority of bees are solitary bees. They live in pairs, monogamous pairs. And we don't know about that. So our role as designers sometimes, and many of the natural bee nests out of Europe are nests on trees, a natural shape that they create. These bees are architects. Yes, and that's another thing when we talk about architecture. We talk about the architecture of the others, very rarely, but perhaps we should. So design offers a very powerful interface, I think, to bring many, many issues alive and to bring to a point where they can be discursive and can carry on knowledge, or can give knowledge to those who've never had it, the school children who've never really kept bees. So I come on to a philosopher. These days I'm happy to go to anthropologists, to philosophers, to ecologists, to agronomists, to whoever I need for inspiration to work in the way I want to work as a design researcher. And he talked about aesthetics. He was actually talking about the art world. So he's talking about the regime of the art world and how it was controlled and how aesthetics was controlled. But he came up with this definition of aesthetics, refers to the distribution of the sensible, the sentient, what we sense, that determines a mode of articulation between forms of action, production, perception, and thought. So as designers, if we can change a little bit of thought, or if we can change a perception, or if we can take an action, maybe it leads to a different production. Or if we do a different kind of production, it leads to a different kind of thought. I've always liked this combination. So as a designer, you can choose where you work. And of course, if you remember that wonderful film by Charles and Ray Eames, The Powers of 10, where they zoom on a 1 meter square, they zoom out and you see a couple on a picnic, and then they zoom right out and you see the earth eventually, and then they zoom in again and you zoom down to microns in the soil. It's a wonderful reminder as designers, what scales are we working on and what scales are we impacting on. And these are all frames that I'm giving you really here, and I'm not saying which is the right one, and you have to make sense of them. But so Stephen Luke argues too that if we materialize things, if we facilitate certain things coming into being, then we are having an ethical practice. Of course, if you do that just for Google or Facebook or McDonald's, yes, you're practicing within the ethics of those companies, which might not be what you really want to practice in. So he says in our designing we unfold an ethical practice. So if we're thinking about that for this workshop, nature-centered design, we've had human-centered design. This was so we could design better things for humans. We've had user-centered design, where we would design better things for users. And now this week we're talking about nature-centered design. But this, as you already see, is much more entangled. And we have to figure out, as designers or design researchers, well, where do we take our step? Where do we make our thought? Where do we make our perceptive shift? At what scale and with whom? I got a handout for the workshop, actually, summarizing this, but I talked about this idea of beautiful strangeness in 2009 for my book, Design Activism. And it's a long list of things here. But maybe the one I pick out is from the philosopher Tony Fry here, that we do design that does not defuture. What he meant by defuturing is that if you design this way, you stop the ongoingness. Something cannot become because you've stopped the possibility. If we now start to talk about the people who took the goats to Desertus Island as being designers, the minute they decided to take the goats to the island, they defutured the future of many of the plants there. In simple terms, they got eaten by the goats. But this decision, if a forester decides to plant trees on a hillside that shade out the native vegetation, if you look at the eucalyptus in Portugal, and the consequent fires as a result of that decision to put the eucalyptus in, this is a design too. And so we start to see, and for me it's very strange, I started my life as an ecologist, I worked with a lot of foresters actually, and they were very humble people, they were very acutely aware if they made a mistake, it would live for 100 years. So they, in some ways, saw themselves as designers. And I think I'm saying this because we who have the title designers and somehow are professionally trained somewhere in this idea of design have to understand that others too are designing in different ways. And if we're going to deal with this topic of nature, we have to find a way to converse with these people, because they might also be designing on very different time scales. And this is an example of that long list of things. This is done by future farmers. Actually, hopefully, Amy Francescini is coming to teach with us in the University of Bozen-Bolzano soon. We teach together. And future farmers are artists, designers, and many other people from 1995 in California. And this is a project to enable school children to go and sample their local water to find the green algae that produce the most hydrogen. And it was a collaborative project with the Renewable Energy Laboratory in America that wasn't getting funding. Why? Because the oil lobby didn't want more renewable energy. So they really struggled on funding. So they made all the school children into little scientists, running around sampling the streams and lakes of America to find which blue-green algae produce better hydrogen. So this is what I would call design as facilitation. Not only does it take the children to understand algae, maybe they've never done that before, but they become involved in this living world. They become agents. And the algae, of course, under Bruno Latour's terms, are actants. They act on the world. The algae produce gaseous, some oxygen, some hydrogen. And this is a long list too. When I updated my thinking on beautiful strangeness 10 years later, for this publication, it's just coming out. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I started putting in, maybe these last two are quite important, but beautiful strangeness encourages new symbiotic human, non-human relations, and that it is regenerative. Regenerative in the present and the future. I think if we're going to do nature-centered design, it must allow the possibility of regeneration. It must allow future possibilities, not stop them, or prevent them, or kill them. So, yeah, long list. If you're interested, you can always contact me. I can send you the publication. And this might be a kind of good example of that. It's work by a Dutch designer, Henriette Waal, and she did it as part of a project called Edible Landscapes. And this is a brewing to brew beer. It's a trailer you can pull around. And she would take us to a community. She would find the local people who were brewing experts. She would find the ecologists. She would get the local people together, and they would go out and harvest plants and make a beer. And actually the water too was often came from the natural rivers and ponds and was filtered. So this was really a terroir beer, unique to that community, that time, the plants, and I still think it's a wonderful project. She's taken it to many communities now since 2009. And this is another way of introducing us to what is there. I think for me, I grew up in the countryside. I learnt my plants and birds and animals by walking around it and by talking to people, of course, who had knowledge. But it always made me curious to look, where am I walking? For people who grow up in city areas, it could be 50% of the world in 2 decades' time. Yes, they have plants in the city too, but it seems that's an artificial arrangement, arranged for highways and buildings and everything else, and you can still observe them. In fact, we have urban ecologists who will tell you there's a lot of ecology in cities. Some of it refuge from the agriculture, which is outside the city. So you actually have high populations of bees and foxes in the cities now because they've been pushed out to the countryside. So this to me indicates at least a very interesting direction to go in when we talk about nature-centered design, is to weave back these entangled relationships. If we had to have a piece of land and grow all our food, we would have a very intimate relationship with nature. And we'd be designing every day to maximize our food, at least. But we'd have to know how everything worked. And we've lost that intimacy. So maybe nature-centered design is re-entangling. It's creating more relationships. I just keep an eye on the time. So the beautiful strangeness I talk about here is intrinsic. It's the intrinsic beauty of the materials we use as designers. It's the aesthetic effect. It's the intrinsic, the affect of the artifact on our experiences and our perceptions and emotions, what Rancière was talking about. And there's this effect of the artifact, I called it futuric aesthetic. It's the effect of what's the future aesthetic effect of this chair? Is it the future in something else? So everything we design has a possible effect in the future. Maybe this echoes Tony Fry's ideas of defuturing. And then I came across this recently by Chen. He's an environmental ethical philosopher. And he talked about 4 keystones of ecological aesthetic appreciation. The centrality of ecological knowledge. So we've actually been visiting experts over the last few days who have deep ecological knowledge. Because this scientific cognitivism, the rejection of the duality of humanity and the natural world, this human-nature divide, which is a construct, of course, it's a thought and it's a perception. We have to find a new aesthetics of engagement there, where we don't see ourselves as separate. And then these last 2 are interesting, because he said that ecological aesthetic appreciation is also appreciating the overarching value of the ecosystem diversity and health. How do we train our citizens? How do we train ourselves to have an ecological aesthetic appreciation for an ecosystem? It's a big challenge. And then the continued guidance of ecological ethics. So it's interesting that the philosophers too are thinking about that aesthetics now is no longer just a thing in front of us. It's no longer the film that we just saw or the books downstairs. It's really about what those do to the health of ecosystems and what those do to our continued guidance for an ecological future, which is what we're already entangled in. And I was at Adesso, we were talking about aesthetics actually, and at the end of the conversation, I think you remember it, I just popped up this phrase, regenerative aesthetics. I don't know what it means to design yet for regenerative aesthetics. Well, no, I think I do a little bit. It's to design so we don't destroy what we have, and so we don't destroy what future living things could have. That might include our children, of course. And then the other thing here was this idea of situated potentiality. If we go to, I don't know, let's say the latest tourist development here in Madeira, is there a situated potentiality there to find a better way with nature, or have we already killed the possibility? If we go to Desertas, is there a situated potentiality there to make a better future for all the living things on Desertas? Well, maybe we could make a better one if we simply remove the goats. And we have a lot of technology that could help us do that. If you bring in the military with their infrared cameras at night, we'd find every goat, I think. We could probably find every goat very quickly. This would change what happens next on those islands. So I'm going to read this because it relates to this idea of entanglement, and it's something I wrote 5 years ago about relational design. Of course, I was building off the Buriant's idea of relational art, but I extended the concept quite a lot. So relational design. I've been talking actually all evening about relations. And what relations do we want? What relations do we want to create through our designing? So relational design is an evolving set of design practices which found base their theoretical and practical directionality on the whole of human and non-human interaction and interaction. We shouldn't forget the interaction within ourselves, because how we choose to think and act and do affects our interaction with others. So we shouldn't forget this. Within their social context. So the social context I'm in today here in Funchal is quite different from where I'm in Bolzano in the northeast of Italy, in this strange German-Italian culture. So we have to be super aware of the social context we're working in. This involves considering the human and non-human actors and actants. I just explain again that Latour, this is a Latourian term, actant, means this chair is an actant. It's certainly acting in this room at the moment to keep you off the ground. So all objects, all things, all materials can be actants. And they're socially perceived and understood material assemblages. Again, we have a material assemblage here. It's called a presentation with an audience and a speaker. And there are certain things arranged here in this assemblage. Oh, and we have heat as well. So here is a material assemblage. To think of these things as a unified living entity with mutual and respectful relationality. How do we, through our designing, create respect? How is it mutual? I noticed Rose was cutting the flowers. Is this a mutual activity? I don't know. Did she allow the flowers to produce their seed or not? When you cut flowers, normally it's before the seed has arrived. So it's very difficult, this idea of mutuality, because we are anthropocentric. It's part of our nature. And implicit in relational design, of course, is an ethically driven design inquiry. So imagine you're giving this description to a product design student who does a chair. How do they start interpreting it? It's very challenging, because it's well beyond the boundaries of our economic construct. And on another day, I give you a whole talk about design and alternative economies, because one of the things that we look at as we move around the world is a one-fits-all economic model, a neoliberal economic model. And it doesn't think about these things. It doesn't think about mutual respect in relationships, not even amongst humans. You know, wage labour for stitching clothes and delivering your food on a bicycle. Now, this is a wage labour using a certain economic model which is not mutually respectful. I go on, just to finish. So what kind of, a few questions for the people on the workshop. What kind of actors and actants can co-become together? I'm building on Arroway's phrase here, in new material assemblages. If we start to think about what we put together as components, almost like a jigsaw, what kind of jigsaw do we build as designers? Actually, I think it becomes a bit more interesting to think about this. How do we build these jigsaws? What role can designers and complementary relational designers, can we design with the plants? Of course we can. We've been doing this through agriculture for 10 millennia or more. And to encourage these assemblages of symbiogenesis, how do we move into the future together? Can this become nature-centered design? And just very quickly, I'm going to skip through some slides here on a project that I'm doing in South Tyrol, Aalto University, which is this province in the northeast of Italy, which got given to Italy in 1919 as a result of the Versailles Treaty. So it's bilingual, Italian and German, and there's Ladino, there's another language too. And I'm doing a little project called What Could a Farm Be? I'm trying to bring together small farmers, artists and designers. And I'm trying to merge their practices and knowledge a little bit. We call the network muu-baa, which you probably get. The last workshop, this is the last workshop we did in 1st of June. We haven't really had a chance to synthesize the results. But this is a pile of shit here. And there are lots of piles of shit all over South Tyrol. And this comes from the milk industry, of course, and the beef industry, because there are cattle involved, and sometimes goats and sheep as well. So we did a workshop. We invited people from the industry, farmers, and people working on, for instance, biogas production, to come and talk about milk and shit. And it was super interesting. We really got some great conversations going. Of course, we facilitated as designers using participatory tools. First of all, we talked them through, okay, what is the milk production here? This is one of the big companies here. They're very small farms, 12 cows per farm, some 2,600 trillion farmers supplying milk here. They put this wonderful image up here, and I think 5% of their production is bio milk. We invited them, but they didn't come. It was interesting. Here's an organic cheese maker. So he has a small herd of cows, and he's making organic cheese. And he's also created a new economic model around that. And some of our students have done some work with him in the past. I'm going fast to allow time for the other speakers. If we start to look at the science of this, a lot of stuff on here, but this is actually a paper from the president of our university. She's a biological conservationist. And these dark areas in South Tyrol is where we have very high nitrogen pollution. Nitrogen comes from the shit, of course. And the dark green there matches quite well. This is the density of cattle. So there's some links there we can make from the science. And this is where the cattle are. And I found this interesting diagram that actually the cattle from the Alps, so the old varieties, tend to produce lower quantities of milk. But they've imported big cows from Germany who produce a lot more milk. And of course, a lot more shit. Yeah. So that's the link here with this graph, okay? More milk, more shit. And as a consequence, to show the entanglement here, for many, many years, the EU kept a milk quota. You could only produce so much milk in the EU, so you only got so much shit, right? But then they took it off, and the milk production's going up. They're encouraging farmers to export milk products, cheeses, yogurt, milk, dried, powdered milk. But the shit stays in Europe. I think it should be a wonderful phrase for a politician, wouldn't it? Let's get the shit out of Europe. So these things are very sensitive, of course, because this is a farming area where small farmers are struggling a little bit. These are the old varieties of cows, and their milk production is quite low. It's 4,300. Some of the big Frisian cows can do up to 6,000 to 8,000 litres of milk a year. So nearly twice the production. But of course they're taking more feed and they're producing more shit. So we did this workshop. First of all, we mapped the milk economy. We're using a system here called the multi-level perspective. So here's all the small farmers, here's all the kind of milk companies, and here's all the policy makers, essentially. So we mapped this with these participants from the farming community. And then we did another map. This is the shit map. We mapped who has the shit. Is anybody doing anything with the shit? And what you see, it's highly underdeveloped. There's no policy at European level about cow shit. There's one or two companies here using cow shit for biogas, to generate local biogas energy. And one or two farmers are composting it to sell to garden centres, so you don't have to buy peat from Scandinavia taken from a natural place. And they're great. You know, if you provide them as designers with the right tools, they're really very creative, these people. So this is nice to get their knowledge embedded into something like this. We have to do a bit of work to clean it up, and then we started getting them to think about concepts. Okay, could we move this big pile of shit into something useful? And they immediately came up, this guy's a beer farmer here, for instance, and these guys are from Bring, which is an organization about best practice of manuring, how to do it in a good way. And they were fantastic. They generated a concept here for a service design, where a farmer could submit his manure for analysis, because the important thing is the manures are very variable. So you need to know the nutrient content. And this service would be driven by the farmers who wanted to sell their manure. Anyway, they created a service design, basically. And they also created a traveling exhibition of shit. And we'd already found this as part of the information we gave them. We found this, the Shit Museum in Italy. And it's a farmer as a designer, because the farmer was creating a lot of shit and he said, what can I do with it? And he's creating ceramics now. You have to go on the website and see the other things they're doing. But this is a ceramic. I think you recognize the shape. And it's made from cow manure. Cow manure is organic matter. You mix it with other clays and you can make a ceramic. And so here's a farmer as a designer. It's wonderful to see this happening. So what you see in this milk and shit story is a lot of entanglement, a lot of things going on. And as designers, if we want to ensure there's a better balance here somewhere, we have plenty of opportunities, I think, to get involved. And underneath the project I'm doing, this has been very difficult, and I'm not sure we'll have an answer. But there are many kinds of knowledge. This is just from 2 published papers, and I put the 2 triangles together because there's a lot of similarity. So we can talk about theoretical knowledge. The scientists love theoretical knowledge, they love universal models. We can talk about practical knowledge. Designers practice, craftsmen practice. And then we can talk about this, which is very important and very neglected. And what you've been experiencing, those of you who don't know Madeira and you've come here for the workshop, you've been absorbing a lot of knowledge this way. This is experiential knowledge, relational knowledge, inbrained knowledge, embodied knowledge. And it's difficult, tacit knowledge, it's difficult to communicate this, but it's always there. It's going on now, between us. And this knowledge is very important. And it's very important too that we can maybe bring it together under the title situated knowledge. So if we visit a farmer who does lemons in Santana, on the north of the island here, the festival's in April by the way, I checked, he can tell you about his land, or her land. He can tell you something that you can't write down so well. He's been walking, or she's been walking that land, been doing things with that land, been doing things with the lemon trees, that might be very difficult to turn into practical knowledge or theoretical knowledge. But we need all of these forms of knowledge, I think, to really find better ways of re-entangling. And as designers, I'm always more than happy to work with people with very different kinds of knowledge. And I think if we're going to do this nature-centered design, one of the things we can do is use participatory design techniques to bring these different knowledges together, to find new entanglements. And I think Well, this is just the multi-level perspective. If you're interested, it's used a lot. This is the micro-innovations, the socio-technical regime, and the socio-technical landscape. The idea is that we can disturb this socio-technical regime, industry, policy, technology, culture, with micro things that go on. We can disturb it. Maybe there's something big happens in the socio-technical landscape. So today we assume that most people are digitized somewhere, like digitally. This is a landscape, okay? So this model is very useful to thinking again as designers. I'm used to operating on different levels here. A lot of designers tend to work more here. But it doesn't matter, we have to have some awareness. It might be you need somebody from knowledge higher up the multi-level perspective. So I know it's a bit dense, but just remember entanglement, and that will do. Thank you very much.